Thank you very much for the organizer for having me and having us here, and for the lovely hospitality. I love Jordanians, I would say. During the conference, we'll hear a lot about, I guess, the social contract in Jordan. Social contract refers to the mode of relationship that historically developed between the state and its citizen, and seems to have collapsed in the last couple of decades. My talk will trace the formative period of Jordan during the time of the British Mandate, when this contract was first created and shaped. The argument I want to pose is here. The pattern of state-tribe relations established during the Mandate and the colonial legacy had crucial implications for Jordan. The Mandate period laid solid foundation for the development of the Jordanian state and is one of the keys to understanding the state's resilience ever since. It created a broad social base of support for the state in Jordanian society, something that was lacking in many Middle Eastern countries and other new states in the colonial world. By giving many tribesmen a clear stake in the existence of the state and regime, the Emirate authorities created staunch supporters to prove their loyalty in times of crisis. The Mandate period also saw the building of an institution of state that proved capable of dealing with serious challenges after independence. By staffing the military and bureaucracy, content tribesmen controlled the corridors of power and came to defend the regime against potential or actual rivals. This arrangement formed the basis of the social contract between the regime and its original citizens. In return for the loyalty and support, the citizen expected the state to provide for their material needs and respect their culture. What worked well during Jordan's first 80 or so years seems to have broken down. Because my talk is the second lecture of the conference, I thought it could also give some kind of a necessary historical background on Jordan creations and state formation process. So let's begin. Jordan emerged from the encounter of three elements: local society, the British, and Abdullah bin Hussein, the son of the Sharif of Mecca and one of the leaders of the great Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during World War I, as you can see in the presentation. When Abdullah arrived in Maan, a small town, Abdullah and his dynasty. When Abdullah arrived in Maan, a small town in the south of Transjordan, in November of 1920, he found a sparse population, mainly tribal. It composed of nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes, as well as peasants who lived mainly in the north. Amman, what I showed you is the Maan railway station, which is considered in Jordan until today to be the first palace of Qasr al-Awwal, and it's actually commemorated on the 5 dinars note, about 20 shekels or so. Amman, soon to become the capital, was a tiny village of 3,000 or perhaps 5,000 inhabitants, half of them Circassians. Here you've got some photos of Amman, probably in the early 20th century, the Roman theater, and this is Amman, probably sometimes in the 20s. The largest town was Salt, with 10,000 to 12,000 inhabitants. All in all, there were just over 200,000 people. The territory was ruled by strong tribal confederations whose power posed a formidable challenge to every attempt to build central government. These tribes exploited the political vacuum created by the Ottoman withdrawal in order to reorganize and achieve control over vast regions and weak populations. During World War I and its aftermath, tribes accumulated military experience, weapons and money, and their leaders became more sophisticated. Upon his arrival, Abdullah spent several months in cultivating tribal leaders and forming political alliances, some of which lasted for decades and were renewed generation after generation by his successor and the descendants of those sheikhs. In March 21, he entered Amman and in effect forced himself upon the British, who were about to convene in Cairo in order to decide the post-war policy in the Middle East. Here, the Cairo conference. I think the most important thing in the picture, two tigers on the left, coming from Somalia. At the time, the British government viewed Transjordan as a buffer region between Palestine, the Arabian Peninsula, and Iraq. It also feared that the French forces in Syria encroach upon the territory that was supposed to be part of the British mandate in Palestine, according to Sykes-Picot Agreement. You can see the lines here. But in these years, British had still not formulated its policies regarding this territory. Accordingly, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill and Abdullah reached a temporary agreement in the system of classic indirect rule. The British granted Abdullah and his government financial and military aid. A handful of officials aided Abdullah in advisory position and reported to the happening to the British government in Jerusalem. This is, you can see probably Churchill and Lawrence in the middle and Abdullah in Jerusalem when they reached the agreement. And then here is again Lawrence coming.
Same picture.
Yeah, exactly the same picture. Yeah. They are now back in Jordan, in Amman, when Abdullah started to form his government. Okay. Again. Gradually, the arrangement became more permanent. In September of 1922, the British declared Transjordan's exclusion from the territory designed for the Jewish national home and administrated as a separate political unit under the government of Palestine. I mentioned the white paper of 22, that was one of its results. In 1928, it regulated its relations with Abdullah through the Anglo-Judean Treaty, which ensured the state's future independence and recognized Abdullah and his dynasty as the rulers. In the first 3 years, though, British authorities hardly intervened in internal affairs, giving Abdullah a free hand in tribal affairs. While the daily administration of the government was carried out by the Arab ministers, Abdullah worked for the creation and maintenance of alliance with tribal leaders. In order to fulfill his commitment to Churchill of preserving order and security, Abdullah needed the goodwill of the sheikhs, who controlled their areas of influence. He granted them special attention and many privileges. Sheikhs benefited from his intervention on their behalf with the government. They were showered with gifts, lavished with hospitality, exempted from tax payment, and given honorary titles. Here you can see one of the main allies of Abdullah, Sheikh Mithgal el-Faiz of the Bani Sachem, and a more dramatic picture of him. The system allowed Abdullah to retain support and a degree of cooperation from the strong tribes. For example, Abdullah mobilized the tribal confederations of the Bani Sachem and Humanities in order to repel Saudi Wahhabi invasions into Transjordan. Unsurprisingly, not all tribes profited from Abdullah's policies. While nomads like the Bani Sachem or Humanities or semi-settled tribes in the periphery, such as the Majali in Karak, enjoyed Abdullah's direct and benevolent rule, there were others less content. Such were the semi-settled tribes of the Balkan in central Transjordan and villages in the north, two regions in which the government's hold was relatively strong. These tribes felt threatened by both the tightening grip of the government as well as by the encroachment of their nomadic neighbors, who enjoyed Abdullah's favoritism and protection. Tribal discontentment reached climax in 1923 when the Balkan tribes revolted against Abdullah. The tribes' protest was one of the primary causes for the British modification of the position towards the country. In 1924, they decided to curb Abdullah's autonomy and took over the military and administration. The British now aspired to impose their ideas of a modern law-ruled state, rational administration, and a certain degree of official accountability. The British resident Henry Cox and the commander of the Arab Legion, Frederick Peake, instituted reforms in both the administration and military and concentrated power in the government's hands at the expense of Abdullah and the tribes. The government did succeed in stabilizing its rule in the settled region between the Hijaz Railway and the River Jordan. Here you can see the western part of the country, which was effectively ruled by the government already in the 20s. Even nomadic tribes were compelled to respect the government's instructions when they entered the region every summer. They paid taxes on the animals, and land-owning sheikhs paid land taxes. The government improved law enforcement and executed court decisions. Even powerful sheikhs were no longer immune from legal action. Despite these accomplishments, British attempts to achieve tight control over the population failed due to the government's weakness. Until the decade's end, effective rule was limited to the towns and the immediate surroundings. In the outer regions, the government was able to impose its will only when it obtained the tribal leaders' cooperation. Abdullah, aided by his cousin Shakir bin Zayd, remained the principal authority in tribal affairs, primarily those related to nomadic tribes. As the British gradually realized they could benefit from the good relations these two men cultivated with the sheikhs. For their part, the nomads took advantage of the weakness of the government, remaining autonomous in the desert, exactly as had been in the case during Ottoman rule. I'm now moving to the second stage of state formation in the 30s and 40s. The pattern of relations between the central government and the tribes that prevailed during the first decade of the Emirates' existence changed drastically in the first half of the 1930s. The government achieved an impressive degree of power vis-à-vis tribal society. This change was a result of imperial needs, but was also made possible due to the military and economic weakness which the tribes were experiencing. The tribes' predicament prompted the acceptance of government initiatives to ease the situation. Following the escalation of the tribal raids in the Transjordan borders from 1928 until 1930, the British government instructed the authorities in Oman and Jerusalem to impose direct British rule in the desert. For that purpose, they enlisted the services of Captain John Glab, a British officer who made a name for himself as an expert on desert tribes in Iraq. This is his photo sometimes in the late 40s with King Abdullah. In Transjordan, Glab established and commanded the Desert Patrol, a small police force under the Arab Legion, manned by nomadic tribesmen. Glab's success was exceptional. Within 2 years, the raids stopped, and the government expanded its authority in the desert, something that it failed to do until then, the Desert Patrol of the Arab Legion. During the 30s, Glab created a special position for himself as the chief mediator between the desert tribes and the government, to a large extent at Abdullah's expense. Even more than Glab's personal capability, one can attribute his achievements to the tribe's impotence. From 1922 to 1936, Transjordan suffered from an acute economic crisis due to successive years of drought and the effects of the World Depression. The nomads were impacted by additional factors, such as heavy losses of men and property inflicted by Saudi raids, loss of traditional grazing grounds in Saudi territory, and a sharp decline in camel prices. During these years, nomads suffered from poverty, hunger, and many of the members died. Consequently, the tribes needed aid from the government and accordingly were forced to change their attitude towards the very notion of central government. Through financial support, prevention of Saudi raids, provision of employment, clothing and food, offering aid and guidance in land cultivation, and free medical treatment, Glab enabled the tribesmen to survive this difficult period. You can actually trace the origins of the social contract through this period. Glab took advantage of the cordial relations that Abdullah and Shakir had already established with the sheikhs, as well as the tribe's partial integration into the state structure which existed prior to his arrival in Transjordan. His work also involved minimal disciplinary measures. For example, in 1934, he reported that he had never sent a tribesman to prison. In the mid-30s, while Glab was still preoccupied with desert patrolling, the overall process of state building reached a critical mass. This process brought about the strengthening of the central government and its increased involvement in society. The government tightened control over the tribes and began to fill roles which in the not-so-distant past were the exclusive responsibility of the tribes and their leaders. The government expanded its range of activity by improving its ability to control the population and supply services. They enhanced military capability, improved the enforcement of the law, both in the settlement zone and in the desert. Supervision of the recently demarcated borders was tightened, and tax collection became more efficient, primarily as a result of land reforms. The government started to supply fundamental services, offered financial assistance, employment in government bodies, infrastructure, and even health and educational services. In this manner, the government established a central position for itself in every aspect of life. Consequently, tribes became dependent on it. Having said that, the mandatory state never constituted a political entity in which the central rule enjoyed absolute authority, and therefore the tribes were not fully subjugated to its rule. Moreover, tribal organization remained the principal characteristic of society, even encouraged by the authorities, who found the shape to be the better and most cost-effective way to control the population. In the desert, Glab respected the existing social order, utilizing it in order to achieve good results in his work with the nomads. Thus, he gave preference to Sheikh's son in recruitment to the desert patrol, and introduced the appointment of the Sheikhs to the tribal courts, which were initiated by him in 1937. A similar situation prevailed in the settled region, even though the government's position there was more secure. The government ruled through the Sheikhs, not instead of them. It delegated authority to them in areas such as preserving the public order, tax levying, and conflict resolution. Similar to Ottoman policies, the government recognized these Sheikhs' indispensable role as mediators and their aid in preserving law and order by awarding them a state salary. Even Sheikhs who challenged the government and were punished were soon thereafter permitted to return to the tribes to resume their leadership positions. Despite its weakened role, the tribe remained the principal unit of social and political organization in Transjordan. Central government relations with the tribes were administered against the backdrop of two trends. The central government strove to strengthen its power, but concurrently allowed the tribes to preserve a certain degree of autonomy. In order to control the tribes, the government needed to combine methods: negotiation, persuasion, thus influence, financial incentives, and occasionally displays of force. The tribes attempted to preserve their autonomy in the face of the strengthening government. They acclimated to the new circumstances, sometimes through expression of opposition and sometimes compliance. During the 1940s, the process of tribes' subordination to the central government's authority reached its final phase. By that time, the tribes were fully integrated into the state structure. Thousands of the members served as soldiers in the Arab region, while others were employed in various public projects. Many became landowners and tilled the land with government assistance. Tribesmen enjoyed health and veterinary services, and their sons and sometimes even daughters were enrolled in state schools. Tribal leaders and their sons assumed position in the state as judges, ministers, legislators, and other functionaries. Many of them were prosperous and influential and could act on behalf of their fellow tribespeople in government circles. They remained the mediators between the government and the tribes. In fact, the Sheikhs became a part of the state political elite, along with other circles of merchants and government officials who were cultivated and organized by Abdullah and shared interest as landowners. So a few concluding remarks. The process of state formation had far-reaching influence on the tribes, and their character and function changed. When the state mechanism achieved political, military, economic dominance, tribal society developed dependency on the state. Moreover, the tribes, and chiefly the tribal confederations, lost much of their raison d'etre, when many of the traditional roles were gradually taken by state institutions. Security, livelihood, education, and health services were supplied outside the tribal system. However, whereas they lost much of their autonomous existence, tribes became a framework for channeling and allocating resources and services originating from the central government. Moreover, tribal organization, identity, and ethos remained the principal characteristic of society. Many aspects of tribal life persisted and were respected by the government. The tribes, much more than the tribal confederations, remained the most important social and political categories. The legal system, at least among nomadic tribes, continued to be that of the tribal law. Almost every man openly carried arms, designating personal autonomy. The state's ethos remained chiefly tribal, most clearly manifested in Abdullah, who cultivated for himself a shapely image and immersed himself in tribal politics. Look at this is Abdullah in his tent just outside his palace in Maan, Palace, sitting and entertaining Sheikh. On his left, you can see again the same Sheikh with Galilee size, and that's the tent just outside the palace overlooking downtown Amman. In the Middle Eastern context, the tribe's incorporation into the modern state structure was unique in its success, which was achieved with a low level of violence and in many aspects contributed to the tribe's welfare. In this respect, it was different from the experience of other new states in the Middle East, such as Syria, Iraq, or Saudi Arabia, even Israel, where the tribes surrendered only by force and were marginalized in society. In contrast, the policy which Abdullah initiated in 1921 and was later adopted by the British authorities led to the consolidation of the central government and at the same time allowed tribes to keep some aspects of their autonomy. For their part, tribes were active participants in the process of state formation. They influenced its course and developed a clear stake in its success. When different aspects of the modern state served the interests of tribesmen and contributed to their prosperity, they were fully embraced by tribal society. But when the tribes identified the central government's power as a threat to their autonomy, they opposed it. State authorities were forced to negotiate with the local actors in cases of demonstrated opposition. The need to pay commission to the sheikhs in exchange for their help in levying taxes, the reliance of them in keeping a degree of law and order, or the recruitment of their sons to the legion are all examples of the sheikh's broad influence on the political process. The relations between tribes and government were typified by a form of partnership, or even symbiosis. The relationship was highly conducive for the relatively smooth integration of the tribes into the state structure. The individuality of the Judean case and the relatively comfortable relations between tribe and state were to a large degree a result of the character of the colonial rule. In comparison to other British possessions in the Middle East, like Iraq, Palestine, and Egypt, British control over Transjordan was limited and did not aspire to change local society. Instead of manipulating local society and disrupting the social order, the framework of the British mandate facilitated gradual transformation of the Imperial Ottoman legacy to the era of the modern state in a manner that caused less shock or dislocation than in other colonies. This unique development had far-reaching implications for Jordan's longevity after the bestowal of independence in 1946. A solid foundation laid down during the Mandate period is one of the keys to understanding the regime's resilience, its ability to cope with the absorption of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in 1948, and the pressure from the Arab national movement under Nasser's leadership. The successful tribal integration into the state explains to a large degree the Hashemite success in Jordan until today. Thank you.